The Mega Evolution metagame is now fully underway, and it brought some very surprising results to both the Milwaukee and Belo Horizonte tournament. Even though Gardevoir still ended up winning in Belo Horizonte, it was actually Charizard EX that came out on top over in Milwaukee, defeating Gardevoir in the finals. The biggest story, however, was the Mega Absol Mega Kangaskhan deck created by Tord Reklev, or at least popularized, which took both tournaments by storm and managed to get top 4 and second place in each of them. Now this deck is now spreading like wildfire all over the Pokemon TCG Live ladder, and for sure you can expect a lot of it in any event going forward. We are going to now take a look at the updated Mega Evolution tier list and how things changed from the previous weekends. Starting off in the C tier, we have these powerful, cool archetypes that are very good to play, but they probably are not going to be tournament winners. And the first one being Mega Venusaur EX. This new card from the Mega Evolution set is very powerful, and it got the perfect partner in Meganium to double the amount of energy in play, along with the Teal Mask Ogerpon EX to attach extra energies, and also the very powerful Forest of Vitality. Now this deck has everything that you could possibly want in terms of being extremely powerful and good. Unfortunately though, the fact that there's a lot of 1-hit KO options out there at the top, and Zero Edge EX getting so powerful and so good means that the fire weakness is a big detriment to Venusaur EX. Next we have Cynthia's Garchomp EX, which once again can be a pretty powerful deck. The Cynthia's power weight brings Garchomp EX all the way up to 400 HP, which is a lot. And then, because of the low energy requirement, and because the only real grass type Pokemon out there that's really threatening at the moment is Mega Venusaur EX, and it's not very popular, it basically doesn't have any weakness. The biggest issue with this deck is that in order to do the big damage that it needs to, it requires 2 turns. 2 energy attachments to use Draconic Buster, unless you find your Neo Upper Energy, which Hilda is a big improvement to the deck for sure, along with all the fighting type support that we got in Mega Evolutions with Premium Power Pro for even more damage, and the Fighting Gong for more consistency, as well as Psyduck perhaps to really limit Dusknoir overall. But in the end, this deck just comes up short despite the synergy between all these cards. Then we have Ho-Box. This deck can in theory cover every single base. It has Armorers to transfer energy around, it can use Prism Energy and Legacy Energy to cover all the attack cost of the wide variety of attackers, and it has multiple ways to 1-KO opponent's Pokemon, but also it has ways to threaten single price Pokemon in order to take 2 prizes with both Wellspring Ogerpon or Iron Hands. But overall, because the deck relies 100% on Armorer's ability, if it gets aggressively targeted down, it's easy for the deck to just fall apart very quickly. And then we have Typhlosion, which managed to get top 16 in Belo Horizonte, probably its best result yet, and I think it's a big part of the decrease in Dragapult TX Dusknoir play just because of the existence of Psyduck, which the deck of course plays. So by limiting that deck, this deck has a better chance to shine against other things because they don't do this huge damage spread, or they don't threaten it as much. Of course, Shaman also helps with reducing the damage spread potential against this deck from things like Terror Box, so overall Typhlosion can be a pretty powerful attacker. However, as HPs increase with more Mega Pokemon in the future, I don't know if this deck will be able to keep up. And finally we have Crustle, which also had a pretty good weekend. Got top 16 in Milwaukee with this peculiar list featuring Sudowoodo and Shockle, along with the Assault Vest and Therapeutic Energy, which all of those cards combined can actually let you beat Gardevoir quite easily under the right circumstances. If the Gardevoir player knows what they're doing and doesn't bench Monkey Dirty or really limits their bench, it can be a little difficult, but it does have now, thanks to Shockle, a guaranteed way to beat Gardevoir if it gets all the right pieces at the right time. Can it get them though? That's the question. But overall, having Crustle as a standalone Pokemon is very good against a lot of the decks in the metagame, but with Gardevoir still being the #1 deck, I don't know how this deck will really succeed, despite now having the tools to potentially beat it. Then we have Tier B, which has overall more resilient decks, overall more competitive decks, but they haven't gotten super strong results, and or they are not as popular as the ones from the tiers above. So starting off, we have the Mega Kangaskhan bulky sort of attacker. It's a different approach than with Absol. This features Buffalant in order to make Mega Kangaskhan even bulkier on top of the Bravery Charm and on top of the Lively Stadiums. Overall, the structure of the deck that got top 8 in Belo Horizonte is actually similar to the structure of the Mega Kangaskhan Mega Absol deck, but this has a more defensive approach, and clearly it worked out. Then we have the Flareon deck. This deck features so many single copies and a wide variety of attackers. It has Wellspring Ogerpon, it has Flareon, it has Leafeon, it has Terrapagos, it even has a 1/1 Pidgeot line, and it has Bloodmoon Ursaluna. So the deck is trying to cover every single base. It's a very versatile deck, but of course pricing could be an issue in some key moments, and it has a very heavy reliance on Sparkling Crystal. Still a powerful deck though, but perhaps not as powerful as when we started the format with Journey together. Then we have Zoroark EX coming off of a win in Pittsburgh. It didn't do as well as there. It did get all the way into the asymmetrical top cut in Milwaukee with a very similar concept other than the inclusion of Okidogi EX, with the expected rise of Cornerstone Ogerpon EX, which this deck usually just loses to, and then it also got the brand new Yveltal to add an element of control to the deck, which it didn't have before. Then we have Joltik Box. This is the pure Joltik Box version, which actually had a sort of resurgence compared to the Joltik Box Goldengo deck that we had seen more of since the World Championships. Diego Casiraga, the 2017 World Champion, actually ended up getting top 4 in Belo Horizonte with his list. So overall, the deck has had a pretty good result, and it's gonna be important to see if this actually translates into it being more popular in the upcoming events in the Mega Evolution format. Then we have Pidgeot Control, which gained the inclusion of Psyduck, probably the biggest missing piece and why we hadn't seen this deck before at the World Championships or before the Mega Evolution format. The deck features a lot of ways to disrupt your opponent through moving energy, denying items, shutting down abilities, or quite simply trapping something in the active. And overall, the deck is very powerful, but it can also be very frail against someone who knows what they are doing. Control decks always fall into this weird tier A, tier B sort of thing, where they are never popular enough to be considered at a higher tier. However, they can be very powerful and very oppressive if they have the right tool cards. And as we get more sets, as the deck gets more options to play with, this deck has been consistently getting stronger since rotation. And it finally got pretty decent results this weekend. Thanks to Psyduck, it managed multiple top 32s and top 16s across both tournaments. And finally, we have Raging Bolt, one of the mainstays of the format, one of the most popular decks in the format in general. However, its numbers have been dropping consistently since the World Championships. It has not managed a good result, and that's probably due to Gardevoir's dominance over most tournaments. So finally, players dropped the deck. However, with the now rise of Mega Evolution Pokemon, especially the Mega Absol archetype, I do expect that this deck could possibly make its way back to tier A with some solid finishes if a lot of people start gravitating towards the basic Mega Pokemon decks. And so, with the new inclusion of Wellspring Ogerpon, Yerko Valencia, who has been playing the deck for a very long time, managed to do really well once again in the Belo Horizonte Regional. And so now we arrive at the A tier. This tier is comprised of all the decks that were very successful, not just in results but also in numbers. Even if they didn't quite get a top cut this weekend, I do expect big things from any of these decks, especially since they can go toe-to-toe against the top 2 decks in Tier S as well. So starting off with Terrabox, this is very similar to the Flareon deck, or the Evolutions deck rather. This one is just less focused on the Evolutions and more focused on Pikachu EX and Wellspring Ogerpon in order to apply a little bit more pressure a little bit faster. Yeah, it has less moving pieces than the other Flareon deck, but this one can be very powerful, and this deck has been on the rise since the World Championships, especially piloted by Alex Szymanski. Then we have Ceruledge EX, which is one of the very big winners from the Mega Evolution set. The Lunatone Solrock engine is basically the perfect pairing for Ceruledge, probably what it was missing to really become an incredibly powerful and consistent archetype. Extra draw power and extra ways to discard energy is just absolutely perfect, and Ross Cawthon, who has been piloting the deck for a very long time, finally got a very good placement with the deck in his venture to get yet another World Championship invite for this year's Worlds. This deck can 1-KO anything in its path, and it can play Briar to cheat a prize card somewhere down the line. So despite all the early aggressions, despite the use of Squawkabilly and the subpar Carmine, it just hits very hard, very quickly, and that's why this deck did really well in this first Mega Evolution format, and I do expect great things coming from it in the near future. And then we have Dragapult Dusknoir, which of course the release of the Psyduck promo in Mega Evolutions is actually a very big deal for this deck, completely nullifying a big part of its strategy, which is that Curse Blast ability on both Dusclops and Dusknoir. However, that didn't stop it from having very good results, and not every deck includes Psyduck, and just because Psyduck exists, a lot of players simply choose not to include the Psyduck because they know the card exists, therefore people are less likely to play Dusknoir, and we did see a big decline in popularity for this deck compared to the previous formats, but that doesn't mean this deck is going anywhere, and if you manage to dodge Psyducks along the way, you can still have a very good tournament run, and even deal with Psyduck sometimes yourself through the use of Boss's Orders and Countercatcher, as well as possibly Halucha's Flying Entry. Then we have Grimmsnarl, another apparent big winner from the Mega Evolution set, just because of the existence of Psyduck that has made the metagame a little bit wider, a little bit more varied, and because of Gardevoir's continued dominance and Dragapult's decline, it seems like the new set of decks did favor Grimmsnarl overall. I'm not entirely sure, like I wouldn't pinpoint it to something specific. Grimmsnarl has always been a solid deck, but it did quite well this weekend. It was actually the third most successful deck in terms of amount of players doing well, with one getting all the way into top 8 in Milwaukee and the other getting top 4 in Belo Horizonte. So overall, a very powerful spread sort of deck that has a lot of potential and really enjoys getting paired against the top deck, which is Gardevoir. Then we have Gholdengo, another very successful deck. Didn't quite get top 8. It actually hasn't had like a very strong finish since Piper Lepine's top 8 at the World Championships, but it is a very popular choice. It does consistently allow players to do really well. It just seems like it's missing something to really reach the very end of a tournament. And of course, if it's too powerful, such as we saw in Pittsburgh, then it gets heavily countered by the inclusion of something like Toadscruel. But the new Lunatone Solrock also seem to pair very well with Gholdengo. They have a little bit of anti-synergy because you want energy in your hand to discard to do damage and not in the discard piles compared to something like Ceruledge. However, the extra draw power that Lunatone offers and the aggression that Solrock allows you to have with Cosmic Beam, thanks to the heavy use of Herballoon, that means the deck is doing really well overall and has a lot of potential for the future to get that big solid finish. And then rounding things out is the Milwaukee regional winner, Charizard Pidgeot with Dusknoir combination. Now Jackson Ford was able to win the Milwaukee regional championship, but outside of his result, every other Charizard deck got top 32 or top 64 or around that, so it is a popular choice. Of course, Gardevoir's popularity and Dragapult's decline is the perfect storm for Charizard to succeed. However, it can also really easily afford to play Klefki and Jet Energy to shut down an opponent's Psyduck for it to use Cursed Blast itself, and that's a big thing or a big difference compared to Dragapult. Dragapult doesn't have the self energy acceleration from Charizard, and that really limits how it can potentially use Klefki to try to stop an opponent from having their Psyduck activated and being able to use Dusknoir. However, Charizard doesn't have that issue because it powers itself up through its ability, so you can afford to Jet Energy, promote that Klefki, shut down the Psyduck's Stamp ability, and be able to Curse Blast to your heart's content. So I'm sure that played a big role into Jackson's success, and many players must have felt safe having their Psyduck on the bench, and all of a sudden they got hit with that combo, and that's where Charizard can easily take over games, and of course it really enjoys getting paired against any sort of Gardevoir deck. And finally we arrive at Tier S, the two decks that had the most exceptional results over the course of the weekend in the new Mega Evolution format, and the first one being of course the Mega Absol box deck, which everyone has been talking about. Everyone was very surprised by it, and I mean, even though the deck did get sort of leaked in the days prior to Milwaukee and Belo Horizonte, the deck still managed to get amazing results, getting second place in Belo Horizonte, played by Gabriel Fernandez, and 3 of them made top cut over in Milwaukee, including the deck's creator Tord Reklev. However, he wasn't the highest placing person with this deck. It was actually Hale over Nolte, which had a few differences with Tord's list. I don't know how he came to these, but of course they worked out pretty well, and the combination of Mega Absol with Mega Kangaskhan, multiple Monkey Dory, and Cornerstone, Ogerpon, and Evil Doll is something that we can expect to see from this point onwards as a very powerful deck. It can deal with a lot of things in the metagame. Discarding resources from your opponent's hand is a very powerful effect, and of course having a big powerful dark type attacker is a very nice thing to have in this Gardevoir dominated metagame. However, despite having this powerful Pokemon to deal with Gardevoir and KO whatever they have, the deck does have quite a tough time like just having a dominance against Gardevoir, right? Just having weakness against it is not quite enough, and Gardevoir was still able to prevail and was still able to get first place in Belo Horizonte and second place in Milwaukee, with Aban getting back to back finals over the course of 3 events, which is incredible, an insane run. He's almost disguised himself as Henry Chow this season, but it was Gustavo Wada that ended up winning in Belo Horizonte with a very peculiar Gardevoir deck featuring Mega Gardevoir EX as a way to deal high damage output against many of these big powerful Pokemon. It also featured Drifloon and Braver Charm, something that we hadn't seen in a decent while, and it also featured Iron Bundle as a way to combat the Jellicent EX in the Gardevoir mirror matches. So Gardevoir EX still remains the most dominant deck, probably will remain so for the remainder of the format until April, until it rotates, but that doesn't mean that any other deck is not viable or can't compete. We are seeing the rise of more and more dark type decks with Mega Absol, Charizard, and Grimmsnarl as a way to try to counter it, and this will in turn of course allow other decks to flourish that take advantage of those decks' weaknesses. So that's the new updated tier list. I do expect to see some swings and some interesting things happening in the next 2 tournaments, which happen in Europe, the first one being Lille and the next one being in Gdansk, Poland. And my biggest prediction is that we might see a rise in Raging Bolt EX overall, just because it can deal with that Mega Absol deck, but of course it still struggles against Gardevoir. So that's my bold prediction, but it will be interesting to see what happens in those tournaments. Make sure you tune in to those official broadcasts. I know I will, and I'd love to know what you think of this tier list, and if you think there's other decks that should be listed here, if you think some decks should be higher or lower, let me know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye. ¿Eres de México y necesitas cartas de Pokémon? Busca Hyperbeam Cards en Facebook e Instagram. Y si estás en Tijuana, búscalos en el local G18 y G11 en el centro comercial Otay.